A teacher's sentence instantly rewires a child's brain. When that sentence labels a child stutter-prone, their self-model updates faster than conscious thought can resist, accepting the label as biological fact within minutes. This rapid identity overwrite bypasses critical thinking entirely through neuroceptive trust mechanisms. Repeated exposure to negative labels during critical developmental windows causes dendritic pruning that physically removes neural connections associated with fluent speech, making the suggested impairment neurologically real and remarkably resistant to later intervention. The child's brain begins generating internal speech patterns matching the imposed label, creating auditory feedback loops that reinforce the suggested disability through predictive coding, where expectation literally shapes perception and production of sound. The 1939 Iowa orphan experiment remains unmatched in revealing how suggestibility can be weaponized, not through drugs or pain, but through the simple, sustained application of negative verbal labels by trusted adults in positions of care. In the monster study, fluent children began exhibiting stutter-like behaviors within days of receiving negative speech labels, demonstrating that identity alteration through suggestion operates on a timescale far faster than conventional learning or therapy processes. The same neural flexibility that allows children to learn language rapidly also makes them vulnerable to having that capacity dismantled through suggestion, revealing neuroplasticity as a neutral mechanism that can be harnessed for growth or harm depending on environmental input. Children's inherent trust in adult authority creates a direct neural pathway for suggestion to bypass defensive cognitive filters, allowing labels to be accepted as factual updates to self-concept without the usual reality-checking mechanisms that protect adolescents and adults. As children internalize negative labels, they begin monitoring their own speech for errors that confirm the suggestion, creating hypervigilance that ironically increases disfluency through anxiety-induced motor disruption, completing the self-fulfilling cycle. The suggested identity becomes physically embodied as the child's musculature and respiratory patterns adapt to produce the expected disfluent speech, transforming a purely psychological suggestion into measurable biomechanical changes in speech production systems. Long-term follow-ups revealed that many monster study participants carried speech difficulties and psychological trauma decades later, proving that childhood suggestion can cause enduring structural changes that persist well into adulthood despite removed negative stimuli. The monster study exposed suggestibility not as a rare pathology but as a universal human trait operating on a continuum, where everyone possesses varying degrees of vulnerability to identity alteration through trusted negative labeling, especially during developmental periods. The monster study remains psychology's darkest mirror because it revealed how easily trusted figures can rewrite a child's inner world using nothing but words, demonstrating that the most profound violations of personhood can occur without violence, drugs, or physical restraint, only through the calculated abuse of linguistic authority. In 1939, Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor began their experiment. They selected 22 orphan children. All spoke normally before the study started. Half were labeled normal speakers, the other half were told they had severe speech problems. This was the core deception. For 5 months, therapists reinforced the negative label daily. They criticized every minor speech fluctuation as evidence of defect. Fluent speakers started hesitating, repeating sounds, avoiding words. Their brains internalized the false diagnosis as truth. Some children stopped speaking altogether in therapy sessions. They covered their mouths, turned away, refusing to utter a sound. Her records show chilling observations. Child avoids eye contact, refuses to initiate speech, shows visible distress when prompted. Johnson believed stuttering was caused by listeners' reactions, not the speaker. He sought to prove it by creating the very thing he studied. They aimed to induce stuttering in fluent children to validate Johnson's diagnosogenic theory. Ethics were secondary to proof. Orphan children and their guardians were never told the true nature of the study. They believed they were receiving speech therapy. Children labeled normal received positive reinforcement. Their speech stayed fluent, showing the power of expectation. By the way, if you like this discussion, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more interesting topics coming up. Lightbulb. The stark contrast between groups proved the hypothesis. Negative labels created disability where none existed before. Many affected children carried speech anxiety and shame for decades. The psychological scars outlasted the 5-month study. Despite completing the study, Mary Tudor never published the full results in her dissertation. The truth remained buried for years. He became a renowned speech pathologist. Yet his most famous experiment revealed a terrifying capacity for psychological harm. A child's brain absorbs external labels like water soaks into dry soil, accepting them as undeniable truth about who they fundamentally are. The developing brain operates on predictive coding, constantly forecasting reality based on incoming signals, making it exceptionally vulnerable to repeated negative suggestions from authority figures. When a child hears "you are broken" often enough, their brain begins to generate behaviors that match the label, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the false identity becomes lived reality through altered speech patterns and social withdrawal. Young brains lack the mature prefrontal cortex needed to question authority, so they internalize adult judgments as absolute truth about their core identity, especially during critical developmental windows when neural plasticity is highest. Between ages 3 and 7, the brain's language and self-concept networks are exceptionally malleable, making this period the critical window where negative suggestion can rewire neural pathways and embed false identities at a structural level. Repeated negative labels trigger stress responses that increase cortisol, which over time alters myelin sheath formation and synaptic pruning, leading to lasting structural changes in brain regions responsible for speech fluency and self-worth. Chronic stress from negative labeling damages the myelin sheaths around neurons, slowing neural transmission in speech centers and creating the physical basis for psychologically induced disfluency that mirrors organic stuttering. Under sustained negative suggestion, the brain mistakenly prunes away healthy synaptic connections in language and confidence networks, interpreting them as erroneous based on the false belief that the child is fundamentally incapable. Broca's area, responsible for speech production, shows reduced activity and altered connectivity in children subjected to prolonged negative labeling, directly linking psychological trauma to measurable neurological speech impairment. The default mode network, which governs self-referential thought and self-worth, becomes hyperconnected to fear and shame circuits, causing the child to automatically associate self-reflection with negative emotion and inadequacy. What begins as psychological suggestion eventually becomes embedded in the brain's physical architecture, making the false identity feel as innate and unchangeable as eye color or handedness, resistant to later contradiction or praise. Once negative suggestions become structural, the brain actively resists positive input that contradicts the internalized label, interpreting praise as deception or mistake, which explains why early trauma can persist despite later supportive environments. Social media algorithms silently assign invisible labels to users based on behavior patterns. These digital tags determine what content you see and who sees your posts. Shadow banning operates as a modern form of behavioral suppression without explicit notification. Platforms reduce content reach without banning accounts, creating confusion and self-doubt in creators. Users notice declining engagement but receive no explanation, leading them to question their own content quality or relevance. This invisible punishment mirrors the psychological impact of the monster study's negative labeling. Schools increasingly apply ADHD and learning disability labels to children exhibiting normal behavioral variations. These diagnostic tags follow students throughout their academic careers, influencing teacher expectations and self-perception. The expansion mirrors historical patterns of institutional overpathologizing. Educators unconsciously adjust their expectations and interactions based on diagnostic labels assigned to students. Children labeled with ADHD often receive less challenging material and more behavioral corrections, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of diminished academic performance and reduced opportunities. Students begin to believe their labeled identity reflects inherent inability rather than environmental response. This internalization leads to avoidance of challenging tasks, reduced classroom participation, and diminished academic ambition that persists long after the label might no longer apply. Annual performance evaluations in corporations function as institutionalized labeling systems similar to the monster study. Employees receive fixed ratings that influence promotions, compensation, and career trajectories for years, often based on subjective manager perceptions rather than objective metrics. A single negative performance review can label an employee as not leadership material or difficult to work with, affecting opportunities for years regardless of subsequent improvement. These organizational labels create lasting career ceilings that are extremely difficult to overcome through merit alone. Employees labeled as problematic begin to anticipate negative feedback, increasing anxiety and actually worsening performance in evaluative situations. This creates a feedback loop where the label generates the behavior it predicts, trapping individuals in cycles of diminished professional confidence and opportunity. Recovery begins with recognizing that labels are external judgments, not inherent truths about capability or worth. Individuals must actively challenge internalized beliefs by seeking evidence that contradicts negative labels and rebuilding identity based on verified competencies and achievements. Regularly examining every identity tag you've accepted without evidence reveals how many limitations are socially imposed rather than personally true. This practice involves listing labels from childhood, school, work, and social media, then questioning their origin and validity through objective self-assessment. Anti-fragile self-concepts strengthen when challenged by negative suggestion, using opposition as fuel for growth rather than accepting it as truth. This involves developing core values independent of external validation and creating feedback systems based on personal goals rather than institutional labels. Enhance your audio experience with the amplifier AK-45, AK-89, and BT-296 Bluetooth EQ audio amplifier Karaoke Home Theater FM Radio 600W amplifier original. This powerful 600W system delivers crystal clear sound for home theater, karaoke, and music playback. Click the link in the description to purchase yours today. True freedom comes from becoming the author of your own identity rather than allowing algorithms, institutions, or others to define you through labels. This sovereignty requires ongoing vigilance against new labeling attempts and the courage to live according to self-determined values and evidence-based self-assessment. Survivors of institutional labeling describe a profound shift when they first question the validity of the labels forced upon them during childhood. This moment of doubt becomes the first step toward reclaiming their authentic self-narrative from external definitions. The label audit involves systematically listing every identity tag one has internalized, from shy to troublemaker, and tracing each back to its original source, often a single comment from an authority figure decades ago. For each label, survivors ask, what concrete evidence supports this judgment? Was it based on a single bad day, a teacher's bias, or a standardized test that failed to capture their true abilities? Cognitive reframing protocols teach individuals to actively reinterpret past negative labels as misattributions or situational responses, transforming "I am stupid" into "I struggled with that specific task under those conditions." Anti-fragile self-concepts are built not by avoiding criticism, but by developing psychological resilience that actually strengthens when challenged, much like muscle grows under resistance training. Reclaiming narrative sovereignty means becoming the author of one's own life story, recognizing that while past labels may have influenced early chapters, they do not have the final say in who one becomes. Survivors recommend a brief daily practice, spending 5 minutes each evening to review any negative self-talk that arose, questioning its origin and validity before allowing it to settle into belief. Parents and educators who understand these dynamics focus on praising effort and process over fixed traits, helping children develop self-concepts based on controllable actions rather than innate, unchangeable qualities. By healing their own internalized labels, survivors prevent passing these limiting beliefs to their children, breaking intergenerational cycles of institutional harm that can persist for decades without intervention. The brain's lifelong capacity for change means that even deeply ingrained negative self-beliefs formed in childhood can be altered through consistent, intentional practice of cognitive reframing and self-compassion. Survivors find profound strength in connecting with others who have undergone similar experiences, realizing that their struggles were not personal failures but common responses to harmful institutional practices. Reclaiming narrative sovereignty is not a destination but an ongoing practice of self-definition, where each conscious choice to reject a false label reinforces the authentic self beneath the layers of imposed identity. Welcome! Before we begin, hit subscribe so you don't miss our daily updates. Bell next episode. A plot twist you won't expect. Subscribe now. Face screaming in fear.